All right. So contingency planning, maximum tolerable downtime, or MTD. That's the time allowed for your business objects to be down. RTO, recovery time objective, that's linked to MTV. It can't be longer than the MTV. How much time is acceptable to recover your business objects? And recovery point objective, or RPO. How much time data are you willing to lose during an incident? How often do you do a full backup? For COOP, continuous operations plan, need to restore missions essential functions within 12 hours for up to 30 days. Next slide.
And the reason we brought these definitions up is, these are the basis of contingency planning. So these are definitions that, any environment wanting to do contingency planning, which you have to do in the federal public space according to FISMA. These are definitions that you need to understand, and that will be explained and addressed in the next couple of slides.
Okay.
So
go ahead, Bruno. Sorry.
So for this first poll that we have is basically we're interested to know if you know about your RPO for business objects. What is your business objects RPO? Okay, do you know it? Is it 12 to 24 hours, 24 to 48 hours, or you're not sure? So either you don't know, that's possible, or we're just curious to know, your timelines around that. It depends of which industry we're doing this poll with, and different industries, don't necessarily know what it is, or for some people it can be a few hours, or it can be a couple of days. It depends very much. Let's see what the results are. I think most of you have voted. So not surprising. I think about 50% of you don't know, and that's really not a surprise. And yeah, so then the remaining people who voted, it's split between 12 to 24 and 24 to 48. And what we see most of the time is really it's less than a day. That's what's commonly accepted.
Okay, so contingency planning, the iPhone analogy. So you need to understand your contingency strategy, understand the impact, and create a contingency plan. Document and train, it's not my strong point, but it's good practice to have. If it's written down, anybody can follow it. Ensure that the plan has been tested and that you have a maintenance process that follows that plan. And ensure rollback to the initial site is optimal. You can roll back to a different set of servers, but it's not supported and it creates a lot more problems than you need to get into. So if you can restore to the servers where it was initially installed, it will make your life a lot easier. Bruno, anything to add on that?
No, I think that's it's a good analogy, John, because it's actually it's very much the same than what we've seen in business objects. So no, I would agree. It's pretty much the same. So that's a good idea.
Okay. Okay, so I'm not going to read from the slides anymore. Everybody can read them. But some of the things, like at the agencies where I do consulting, business object is their only mechanism. Sorry, is their only mechanism for reporting out of their financial system. So we have pretty tight standards on our downtime. We shoot for 99% uptime, and we hit that just about every month. We did have one instance where we were running low on space on one of the servers, and one of the IT folks deleted our business objects installation to free up some space. And that initially caused some headaches. But then we were doing our backups using 360 Plus, and we were able to get the system back up and running that same day. Now, it was probably a 12-hour turnaround, but I have one gentleman who comes in at the crack of dawn, so he discovered it right away, was working on it before I got to the office, and I would say by 4:30, 5 o'clock p.m., which was almost a 12-hour day, we were back up and running. So that was good. They weren't happy that they were down for the day, but it could have been a lot longer if we didn't have those backups in place. And we followed our process almost to a T, and it worked really well for us. I mean, we did lose a day, but it could have been a lot worse. Bruno, anything to add on that?
No, that's yeah, that's a good example of real life. And what can you tell us, John? Typically in terms of when you talk about contingency planning, backup, what can you tell us about the notions of system and systems?
Okay, so because business objects is a system, but it interacts with, we have it tied into our HR platform, our financial platform, our fixed asset platform, and our time and attendance platform. So it's not just a system you're restoring all of these systems. So it's not just a one-off kind of thing. Without business objects, they can't do reporting on any of these systems. So it's not standalone, if you will. While it may seem like it's the business objects environment, it's how they interact with all of those systems. So it's important to note that that interconnectivity is probably going on at numerous sites. And so you're not just restoring one system, you're restoring your access to all of these systems.
Yeah, that's correct. And that's actually clearly mentioned in the NIST document around contingency planning. And then we'll be actually sharing that, the link to that document at the end of this presentation. And John, analytics typically are pretty complex. And I think what we've seen in many cases is a lot of people underestimated analytics because they don't necessarily understand that analytics are really interconnected with multiple data sources. And then at the same time that the information collected from analytics is actually shared to multiple BI solutions. And that typically is something that's not always understood. And as a result, you can see that, okay, for example, BOBJ is actually, it's a center part because it collects and it shares. And yeah, to your point, it's got to be seen as as systems rather than as a system itself.
Yeah, that's, so with like that day we were down, and that was 2 or 3 years ago, it was, it was almost as if business ground to a halt. They could still enter transactions, but they really had no idea funding wise where they stood. Time and attendance reports didn't go out. The fixed asset stuff, they run those monthly, so that wasn't affected too badly. But it's, when your analytics system goes down, it's amazing how little business really gets done. Like the day-to-day type stuff still got completed, but there was no forward-looking, how do we stand, what can we do better kind of analysis going on. And that, it made me understand that we don't want to go through that again. So we've tried to tighten up our processes, and hopefully if it were to ever happen again, it wouldn't be 12 hours, it might be closer to 5 or 6.
Yeah, and that really depends on the organization and all the requirements, but that's correct. So, in terms of steps. So what we did, based on your iPhone analogy and based on the different readings that we've done around NIST documentation, around FISMA, and then talking with our customers, what we did is we tried to do a framework around contingency strategy for your business objects. So the first thing that you need to understand is you need to understand basically, of course, what's your MTD, RTO, and RPO, okay, at an organizational level. And so this is something that you need to be very clear about it. And when you're talking about business object, are you referring to a system or systems as what we've previously covered? And where are your secondary sites? Are they cold, warm? These are the type of things that you need to know, because based on that, you'll be able to put in place the proper plan for your business objects. So then on the step number 2 for the contingency planning is, okay, you need to understand, once you've talked about the impact on the organization or how the organization itself works, then you need to bring it down actually to your business objects. So how critical is your BOBJ? For some organization it is, some organization it's not. So you need to understand that, because based on that, your RPO, for example, will be different naturally. So you need to understand that, and then based on that, then you'll have a different recovery time as well. You need to understand how sensitive the content is being handled as well. And something that's a lot of people don't necessarily understand, but that's important to address, is how actually is your business objects being used? And who's using it? So sometimes business objects is actually used as a self-service ETL to feed, for example, other BI solutions such as a Power BI or Tableau. So that's something that you need to understand, because in some cases you might have a contingency plan for the other systems, but not for BOBJ. And of course, it won't work because they're all linked together. In addition to how critical your content is, you need to understand, well, who's getting that type of content? How critical it is for them to be getting that content? Who are the power users? So these are things that you need to understand to assess properly the impact of business objects in your contingency planning. So so again, going from the organization now down to business objects and trying to understand the impact of it. So for the third step around contingency planning is, of course, you need to create a contingency planning. So as what I discussed before is you need to establish an RTO and RPO, so of course, based on the organization requirements. And basically, you need to make sure that you've got a very robust plan, because sometimes you might have a plan, but when you want to execute things, things are not working that well. When you create that type of plan, you need to make sure that if there's a destruction of information, whether it's done on purpose or not. Actually, John had some stories with some federal customers where some information was actually accidentally destroyed, and the agency actually didn't have a decent contingency planning, and that forced them to put in place a contingency planning. Another thing that you need to think about when you do a plan like this is make sure that when you restore, there's no regressions. Make sure that the amount of objects that you had before and after are the same. So there are ways actually to be doing this, and make sure, of course, that you've got good performances to put in place and restore your environment. So on the step number 4 is, as usual, in any contingency planning or any process like this, is, of course, you need to document and spend the time to document all your processes, all your procedures, and make sure that you train all the team members so that, for example, if the day that happens, if the admin is not available, okay, how is it going to happen? Are the people properly trained to do it? Make sure that you've got a checklist that people can understand. And if you got a good checklist, it makes, by principle, things very easy. And finally, of course, is make sure that you maintain all these documents and that people constantly are trained around that. Around the next step, step number 5. So, okay, you put in place a plan, you've documented everything. Basically, the next step, of course, is around, you need to be testing and you need to maintain that plan. So, of course, on a regular basis, make sure that you test it. Make sure, again, that the performances are proper, that you're not losing information. Also, one thing that you need to think about is, and that's because of real life, is how are you going to deal with deleted users and content that happened during the RPO? So during that time frame, if your RPO is, for example, 12 hours, some content and some users will have been lost because you're losing basically 12 hours. So for example, if you got sensitive content, as an example is, and that was something, a real life example that we had with some consultants actually at CBON is, some people's were deleted during the 12 hours, and then after the 12 hours, they were restored. And that actually was a big security issue because obviously, they were not supposed to have access anymore to their reports, and that was a big problem. So these are actually examples of real life that you really need to think about because that can be a major security concern on that. Another thing that you need to think about is when you test things, make sure that you've got good performances at your restoration site. So make sure that it doesn't only work, but that the performances are good. And of course, once you test things, make sure that you document, you modify the checklist, and you update things so that you work with step 4. And then the last step, which is step number 6. So a lot of people don't think about that step, but we've actually put that. It's based on real life experiences, actually mainly with some banks, in particular one. Very often what happens is people are testing their contingency planning and their backup. So they're trying that just on a few objects or for a very, very short time. Well, it's not a good practice. Frankly speaking, what you need to do, the right way to do it is every X days, for example, every month, you need actually to have your site B up and running, taking over your site A. And you need to do this for a couple hours or maybe a day or two. And what you will find out, and we've seen that in many, many occasions, is that by the time you restore B to A, there are a lot of issues because you've got performance issues and you need to be benchmarking these after, and you need to think about, okay, how am I going to do the delta between site B and site A? So that's something that's very, it seems very simple, but it's something that you need to think about in detail because that's really based on real life because most deployments actually are not testing that. Okay, so for this poll, we're interested to know, how you guys, are actually doing your BOBJ backups today. Are you doing this, in a manual way through bar files, or are you using like a VM or cloud? You don't do backups. How do you do your BOBJ backups today? So is going to guide us and help us to go through the rest of the presentation. And I'm kind of interested to see the feedback of that. Pauline, I think we can close the poll and share the results.
Okay.
And I wouldn't be surprised, a lot of people don't necessarily know. That's not a surprise. And typically a lot of people are using VM as backups. And I think you've got a lot to say around that topic. That's very common to see that, so.
Right, yeah, we'll talk about that. Yes, that's interesting. And then a lot that don't know. Also interesting, okay. Okay, so yeah, so different disaster scenarios that that we've experienced, I've actually experienced some of them myself, or that we've talked to customers that have experienced them. I know John, his working as a consultant, has experienced some of those. So I broke the server software. I had an issue with this doing an upgrade to Business Objects. I believe it was 4.1 to 4.2. I forget the version. Um, the upgrade was running for hours. I kept checking it, but I wasn't checking the server space. The server admins were getting alerts saying 90% full, 95, 98, and ignoring the alerts filled up the server, and that definitely corrupted the Business Objects installation. So that required, unfortunately, a DR scenario to recover that. Um, the one that we hear the most often, number two, is the deleted or corrupted critical content. So, the users get deleted, their personal folders get deleted. Um, Something universe is corrupted, you need to roll back. A lot of times, to take that full restore of Business Objects like a VM is a lot of work just to get one universe back. So sometimes you will do what you can to not have to do that. But that's probably the most often that we hear about. We actually were yeah, so then number three, malicious actions. So a lot of you remember the government shutdown in 2019 and early 2019. One of our customers had, they just had some, I guess it was just, whoever were keeping the lights on, they weren't the regular Business Objects administrators, they were maintaining the servers. I suspect they ran a disk space, could have been malicious. I'm not sure. Bruno thinks it was malicious, but I think it was disk space. They sorted on largest files and just started deleting, and they ended up deleting content out of the FRS input and output directories. So when the users eventually came back and after the shutdown, they logged in, they click on their reports, and they would get that error, INF error. The reports were still in the CMS repository, so in the database, so they could see them and it looked like they were there, but there was no file associated with the reports. Behind the scenes, it was deleted from the file store, so there was no way to get those back. So those kinds of things, that they're not in the recycle bin because they weren't deleted from Business Objects, they were deleted from the server. So that was one scenario that we helped a customer with to recover from that. Maybe your data center is not available. So we work with a lot of customers on the West Coast, and one customer that I was working with recently, they were setting up their data center. They're on the fault line in I believe they were somewhere in San Francisco, and they wanted their backup data center to be, outside of that fault line. So if there was an earthquake where they couldn't get to that data center, their secondary site was outside of any potential, natural disaster that might happen. Um, and then maybe the server's down. Maybe there's a hardware failure, disk failure. That probably is more with not with VMs, but maybe with some physical servers if you still have those. But these are kind of all the scenarios that we've encountered, or our customers have encountered. So yeah, so the limitation of backups, I'm sorry, of VM backups. So this was one of the things that that from the last poll you had shared, that a lot of people, this is what they have for their backups. And in some scenarios, this will work. To quote Patrick, who had a presentation early, he said, VM backup is a solution. It's just not the best solution. And that's kind of a good way to describe it. If you have a regular VM backup, if something happens, you can have it restored back to the same server. The problem is maybe that backup had the corrupted object in it, or are you willing, if you do the backup once a day, are you willing to lose a day's worth of work just to restore one particular object, a universe, whatever the case may be. The other thing is it's not really transportable. So if you have a VM backup of your production system, how are you going to get that to your DR site? It Business Objects is tightly coupled to the the server where it's installed. So all the pointers to the source system. So that VM is going to have those same pointers. So whether you, you restore it to a DR site, it's going to try to connect back to the source site. You have to go in, essentially hack the CMS to fix that. It's definitely doable, but it's not going to be automated. You're going to have to manually, put in some steps to get that recovered, and it requires, users, administrators that have experience doing that. It's not something that anyone knows how to do. So it might work in some scenarios, like in this example, if you have a very simple setup, everything's on one server, your CMS database, your audit database, business objects, all of your FRS, everything on one server, that might be a good solution, but often, everything's distributed. That makes it more complicated, and it makes it more challenging to recover. So hopefully that explains why sometimes VMs, it's a good backup, but maybe not the best solution for DR purposes for business objects.
And I think, by the way, you were reading some information recently from SAP that was actually
Yeah,
talking about
it's
that.
not it's not supported. It's also not supported as a DR. If you were going to take an image and move it to another server, because you're essentially hacking the CMS database. So yeah.
Yes, so it's not supported by SAP, and actually, in terms of regulation, the main issue is if you've got sensitive content, is if something is corrupted, basically, your VM naturally will be corrupted, so it's useless. So that's why people are leveraging, in general, incremental backup solutions for that.
Right. Okay, so how do you do backups in business objects? A few of you said you do LCM buyer files. We talked to people that they might just create a buyer file for the universes, maybe a couple folders. That's probably okay if you're a smaller environment, but do you always remember, oh, I changed this one universe? Do I have a new buyer file? Where are those even stored? Is it local to your server, to your environment, to your desktop? Do others on your team know where those are or what the state of those are? And then what we traditionally hear is you'll have the DBA do the system and the database. I'm sorry, the CMS and the audit database backup, on your database side, and then your system admins will back up the file server, so your input and output FRS, and then maybe also your servers for your business objects install. Um, we actually were presenting 360 Plus to a customer one time. I think it was Bruno. I think you were with me. It was when I first started, and they said, "Oh, we have a backup. I don't need that
Right.
solution." Yeah. So I said, "Okay, that's fine." And so they, out of the solutions that we have, there were 3 that they were trialing. Within a week, they called and said, "You know what? I thought we had a backup. We tried to restore it, and the file repository server, they were only backing up the output, they weren't backing up the input. So when they went to restore, I couldn't get everything back. So I actually need your solution." So it was something where, unfortunately, they realized, they learned the hard way what was involved. So if you're not testing it, you don't, you may be told, yeah, we're backing it up, but if you don't test it, you don't never know for sure whether it's being backed up. And then restoring is a challenge, because again, when you have that database and that file system backed up, if you need to restore it to another server, all the pointers to the source system are there. It's not going to be the same. Typically, you'll have to, again, hack the CMS to make it work. So it's definitely challenging, and it can be done, but it's not the best approach, and it's not a repeatable, process if you actually wanted to be able to do that on a regular basis.
And at the end of this presentation, in the readings, actually, there is a blog article about the best practices to do this in business objects.
Okay, so how can you do this with 360 Suite? So how is that any different? So with 360 Plus, you actually have the ability to do a full backup, and this backup works differently than anything else that you've probably used. It will creates a backup of all your business objects content. So every object in your environment gets a buyer file, so it all gets backed up, all your users, all your folders, all your documents. So if you need to restore just one document, you can do that, or if you need to restore the entire environment, replicate. We have customers that use that to replicate environments, so they want QA to look just like production. They can use that that backup to do that. They can roll back, schedule. We have, again, customers that use the DR solution in 360 Plus to keep their DR sites in sync, so that rollback task. And then we also have a recycle bin that is different from the business objects recycle bin. Every object in the system will get put in that recycle bin if it gets deleted, so you can restore it. You can if a user gets deleted, it will be in that recycle bin. We've worked with a lot of customers that, they upgrade their Active Directory or LDAP, and all of a sudden the users are gone because in the upgrade they created new user accounts. Someone changed their name, they have a new account. Well, their old account is gone. Their personal content's gone. It's not going to be in the recycle bin because it wasn't deleted, but with 360 you can get that back without losing any of that content.
Okay, so here I was just going to walk you through how easy it is to do a backup using 360 Plus. And if I can do it, anybody listening can do it. So you log into 360 and you click on the backup tasks. You can give it a title, and next slide. Okay, so you tell it the frequency with which you would like to back it up. We have ours set up to do every morning, 6-ish, and then it keeps 30 copies. So we can go back 30 days at any given time. We could go back further, but if there's an issue, we'll find it within 30 days. So we keep 30 days rolling. Next slide. Okay, so here you select those things that you would like the system to back up. You could do one at a time and keep them in separate files. Here, I'm doing them all and putting them in the same file. This is where you would have the maximum number of backups. I set this one to 5, but in production we do 30. You can have the folders excluded, instances, however you want it. It's pretty configurable. It allows you to do a lot of different things. Next slide. And then notifications. We have the notifications sent every morning to let us know how the backup looked. And if we get you can have it set up to do on success with a different message on failure. And so this way we know every morning when we get there, the backup worked or it didn't. And if it didn't, it's usually a connectivity issue. It's not the software, but for whatever reason, the network went down while the backup was trying to run. And I've only seen that happen a couple of times, but it has happened. For the most part, it's pretty flawless execution. Once the backup is completed, we know we're good. And then we could always roll back to yesterday if we had to. And I think that's
Okay,
the
great.
last.
So with that backup, John always has the latest version of every object. Well, he's got at least 5 of the latest versions of every object, so he can go back that far to get all of his content. So that's great. So we were just going to jump into just to show you live what 360 Plus looks like. So when I log in to 360, I'm logging with my business objects credentials. So I'm an administrator, so I have access. You can grant individual users access to certain parts of the system if you want. But again, they would log in with their, I seem to be having this, their individual accounts. Okay. So under tasks, I have all of my backup tasks. So I have a regular recurring backup task. I can change it anytime I want. So, John said his was running at 6:42 a.m. or 6 a.m. every morning. So mine's running at 11 p.m. I could easily change it if I wanted to, schedule it to run at a different time. I've got, all my different content, and it's really, the performance is really good with the backups. If you have a lot of content, we have a option to parallelize the process, which is based on the number of CPUs you have available on your server. So it'll actually back up, that 4 objects at a time if needed. So if you do have a lot of content, that helps. And then, your backup runs. And the nice thing is if you need to, you can easily get back any of your content. So if I come in here and delete this user, so I'm deleting the user. This is like I'm logging in the CMC and deleting the user. In the recycle bin, this is the 360 recycle bin, I can retrieve that user. So if I go in, this is where I can search, and I don't remember the username that I deleted, but I will find it. Okay, here it is. Is that what it was called? So search for my user, and if I right click, I can see all the backups for that user. So again, this is incremental, so it's not backing up every day. I have it running, the backups running every day, but it's only backing up that user when something changes. Maybe the user has a new instance, creates a new Webby document, or security changes. So January 2019 was the first time the user was backed up, and then the last one was May 2019. But this is the most recent, so I can restore this, and that will restore the user, the personal folders. I can restore their inbox if I want. If we use categories, any instances, those can be restored, inboxes. So everything can be restored. That user gets restored. It's like they were never removed. The same security is applied. Any of the anything that was different about or anything that the last login, that's still there. So everything's the same about the user. And then if I go, let's see. And then the nice thing about the backups as well is before you restore, you can actually take a look at, let's see if I have you can take a look at the difference before and after. So here's a Webby report. I can go to I don't have any backup for this one. Let me find another one. So I'm using a different environment right now. So if I go to my backup, I can do a compare, and what this will do is before I restore from the 2018 version, I can compare what is in there right now, what's in the current version, the CMS. It'll tell me what's different between the SQL of the report, the variables, and any of the layout, so I can see that before I do that restore. You can do the same thing with universes as well, which is pretty helpful. So if you want to make sure that you're restoring the right version before you do that, you can do that as well. And then for DR purposes, so, majority of our customers that use the backup, they run the backup daily, and then they use this rollback task, which will allow them to actually restore to a DR site. So maybe they have a recurring. So there's an option to use an external scheduler. I'm working with a customer right now that's going to do that. They're scheduling their backup with a job scheduler, and then they're going to kick off the rollback, which will restore their DR. So once that backup's completed, they're not saying, okay, do this every night at 1 a.m. They're going to say, do this when the backup completes. So that schedule allows you to have that flexibility. And then what they do is once they've synced their environments, they're going to just replicate from another environment. So everything that got backed up that previous day is going to get transferred to the DR site. So that keeps the environments in sync. So if they do have a disaster or have a need to roll over to their DR site, it's just a matter of switching over to the DR site. All the content's already there. and they're ready to go. They don't need to, go through a whole scenario of disaster recovery and hacking the CMS and all of that. So all of the content gets moved over, the access levels, the public folders, and you can uncheck. Usually we don't recommend sending over the servers because you would have those set in the other environment. So this can run regularly to keep your environments in sync.
Thank you, Pauline.
Okay.
So these are the readings that we've actually used to prepare this presentation. So there are a lot of great documentation from NIST, as always. So I really encourage you, if you're interested in the topic, to read them. So these are the two, I think that the two proper readings for the topic. There is a lot more, but these are the main ones. And then we've also added one reading around how you can do it with 360. Another one is around a story that we had with UCLA. Actually, they've got a paper and a recorded session that you may want to watch. That's really interesting, and they're detailing step by step how they've done it. They've done it in a very professional way.
Yeah, and that's
So
sorry.
yeah,
Yeah, and
go
it's
ahead.
also interesting how they went through the process of deciding how they were going to do their business objects backup. I found that interesting. So some of you might, wonder, maybe I want a VM solution, and they'll kind of describe the different scenarios they went through before they decided to use 360. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So we've got one last poll, Pauline, to launch before we go to the questions. What is your interest level in this webinar topic? So are you on just to increase your knowledge? You don't have an immediate need, but you'd be interested to check it out. You've got a project and you like to schedule a demo, or you're actually planning a project and you'd like to get some keys. So just let us know. And so please feel free to be asking your questions. I see a couple questions in the chat box that are coming in, and probably we got time to cover 2 questions, Pauline. So, the first question is, okay, what happens if you need to recover a single corrupted file?
So yeah, with the traditional restore, so if you have one document that needs to be recovered, if you're doing the traditional backup and backup the CMS, backup the file store, you would need to restore that either in the current environment or in another environment. So you'd have to have a similar environment, restore that, do all the repointing because it's going to be pointing back to the source environment, export that particular object and then get it moved over to the site where you want it. It's a lot of work, and I've gone through that before where usually we end up deciding it's not worth the effort to get that one, that one object. With 360, it's really just a matter of, I need to roll back a universe, I need to restore it or roll back to a previous version. It's just a matter of right-clicking, go to my backups, and then restore. And I can get that back, restore all my restrictions, everything can get restored. So it's a simple process, but the traditional method is a lot of work for sure.
Pauline, let's take a last question. I see a question from Madhu. After my disaster is resolved, what is this best strategy to roll back? Okay, that's.
Yeah, so yeah, you can do that with 360, using that rollback procedure. So we do have customers that use 360 for DR, and they do test their DR on a recurring basis, and they've been able to, they keep it up actually for a month. Some of them have kept it up for a time, and obviously there's users logging in, creating content, so they've then restored their content, and it can be done on an ongoing basis to keep, basically how you kept your DR site in sync. You can keep your um, recover back to the primary site.